Before we head into the shop and I put this car up in the lift, I'm going to walk you through what the Hyundai engineers have done to the exterior and cabin space of the Elantra N. While I admit the looks of the Elantra are rather polarizing, personally I think Hyundai has unfortunately given the Elantra the Seth Brundle treatment. You may find this car beautiful, so I will leave that up to you. However, many of the exterior changes done to the Elantra are actually functional. You get far more aggressive aero front and rear on this Elantra N, not to mention the fact that you get Pilot 4S's on 19-inch wheels. Behind those wheels, there is a fairly aggressive brake package for a car like this. The cabin space, thankfully, is largely carryover from the regular Elantra, which means you still get a very big trunk. It's a little bit over 12 cubic feet, making it a touch smaller than the Civic Si, but the real compromise there is due to the added bracing to the rear of this vehicle. Despite still being able to fold down the rear seats, you can no longer pass through larger items through the cargo hold due to that bracing. The rear seats on this car are very usable. I can fit behind myself in my own driving position in this vehicle, which is something I cannot do in the Kona N. I will say the headroom is a little bit compromised compared to the Civic, but if you are, say, below 5'10", you should fit back there with no issues. The front seats in this car are lifted right out of the Veloster N, making them some of the most aggressive seats at this price point. They're heated, they are a mix of leather and Alcantara, and for the most part, given how aggressively bolstered they are, they're pretty comfortable. You can get them nice and low, and you have good visibility in this car. The pedal box makes it fairly easy to heel and toe. The shifter falls right to hand. While I admit it's a little bit plasticky, it's still okay to use. At least you get the option of a manual transmission, and the steering wheel is lifted out of all of the other N products. When it comes to the rest of the control structure of this car, thankfully Hyundai knows not to screw that up, unlike VW. All the HVAC and infotainment controls are physical. Your drive modes are physically controlled, both on the steering wheel and right by the shifter, and the infotainment itself is fast acting and uses wired Apple CarPlay. And this car comes standard with a Bose audio system. While it's not audiophile grade, at this price point, you can't expect a whole lot more. Two things I will talk about when it comes to cons of this cabin. The door storage in this vehicle is kind of pathetic compared to something like a GTI or even the Civic Si, and Hyundai doesn't do the best job hiding some of their cheaper plastics. This car, in certain areas, definitely feels like it's shitbox economy car roots. Some of the door plastics are really cheap, and this, I guess, handle on the center console feels right from Walmart. It's not the best thing in the world, but again, at this price point, in the low 30s, given its performance, it's a very, very impressive cabin space. So with that, let's head into the shop. Mark, we're underneath the Elantra N, and you and I have not always been the nicest to Hyundai and the N brand, but I'm looking forward to seeing what this car is like.
This coming from the guy that's sick. It wouldn't happen to be dealing with too many Hyundais, Mr. Porsche, is it?
No, well, hey, this car was designed by a German man, so I can look past that.
Oh, okay, so yeah, okay. The Elantra is shared with the i30, so if you're not used to this elsewhere, it's the i30. And the big difference here, and why I look at it a bit differently from a performance perspective, is it's not taking a jacked up economy car, CUV or SUV on stilts and then trying to turn it into a sports car. It's a car to start, so you have the inherent advantages of having something that's lower to the ground, thus potentially creating a true performance, affordable performance car. So let's talk about what they did here, Jack.
So they took the Elantra and they threw away the rear suspension. The base Elantra comes with a torsion beam rear suspension. They went to a multi-link. And then the N engineers, genuinely using their WRC cars and all of their prior generation N products, they took the lessons they learned and did their best to make this the most focused performance car. As I mentioned in the interior segment, they did some aerodynamic treatments front and rear that produces about 125% extra downforce over the base Elantra. Yes, it's still a strut front, but they do have an aluminum knuckle and giant front brakes that they both manage the cooling with a basically half style or an open...
they just cut the dust shield in half and put more vents in it, and they do have a kick up there that moves air from this part to the brake rotor, so cooling's not an issue. Even though they don't have brake ducts here, there's ways to cool this. And they've just increased thermal capacity overall and the rigidity of the knuckle, like you said. It's that whole assembly, this whole hub has been just beefed up for track duty.
Yeah, they have a integrated, basically CV, wheel bearing, and hub all in one piece. So it drops about 4 pounds, it's like 3.82. And it adds more rigidity to the knuckles themselves.
And the adjustable dampers, which are variable adjustable, electronically controlled. The strut mount is reinforced as well. The actual ring at the top
It
of
has a dual compound as well.
so the whole mount is stiffer and the strut towers are stiffer. And again, so when you look at traditional eco sports cars or sports cars, usually manufacturers are just like, okay, we put on stiffer springs, bigger bars, better shocks, made it a little bit faster. They have addressed every single part of this car that you would want to do if you're adding all the power. So, when we joke around a lot, and I will say this from my perspective, we get into some of these GT line cars or like the Sonata N line thing where you put all this power to the front, you obliterate the front tires, you can't turn and accelerate. What they attempted to do here was controlling all of that by increasing rigidity of multi-points of the car, bracing, suspension, everything has been touched
Real
here.
bracing differences too. But that giant bar back there increases rigidity by 29%.
That's a lot.
They mounted the steering rack stiffly to the front subframe, so it's solidly mounted to the front subframe. They've done other changes to the body structure, like the trans tunnel. So they've made real changes to this vehicle, not to mention the fact that this is the most powerful version of this drivetrain. So when compared to the regular Veloster N, it has a bigger turbo turbine, which means it produces 1 more horsepower, but up to like 20 or 30 foot-pounds of torque extra over the regular Veloster N. And on top of that, these motors are apparently vastly underrated. It's producing more like 270 or 280 wheel horsepower, which is about what these cars are supposed to be rated at the crank. You get 2 different gearbox options with this car. This car gets the 6-speed manual. When you go with the manual, you get active rev match, but you do lose the ability to get N-Grin shift, which is only available with the wet dual clutch, which is essentially the same unit that you find in the Kona and Veloster N. You get the same E differential in the front and some of those other good bits.
Yeah, so the big part of this, not only that, is electronic tuning of all these systems. The EPS unit, it is a rack-mounted motor, so the rack-mounted motor is moved over to the side, away from the input shaft. It balances out the torque delivery. It's supposed to make it feel more natural. Like you said, it is rigidly mounted to the subframe.
To give you as much feel as possible.
And, speed up steering response. The same thing with the back, the way they've changed the suspension, because when you make changes, and we talk about this with other cars, you stiffen up the front, it has an effect on the back and vice versa.
So stiffen up the bushings in the rear. They try to get this car to actually rotate a bit, which is pretty rare now in a modern front-wheel drive car.
Right, absolutely. The other things too, just subtleties in the back, you do have adjustable toe and camber. So that's good if you're going to be making any types of tweaks to this for hardcore driving. This comes on Michelin Pilot 4S's.
They're much wider.
Which are much wider, and that's not even the most hardcore Michelin tire you can get, but it has an amazing level of grip even on this. So the overhead's going to be even higher, and the chassis is set up to accept even more sticky tire. So again, you're looking at a car that might have some eco roots, but is very refined in the upper trim levels, but you're taking this and amping it up to be able to go out and drive it flat out. And not only that, with the cooling solutions, with some of the other things they've done to this car, you can take it and drive it hardcore right out of the box and take it to the track without having to do a lot of the things that you usually have to do with brake pads, brakes.
Like take my GR86, for example. This car with a manual transmission, with destination, is like 33 grand. Mm-hmm. My GR86 was like 31. Right. Day one, you need to do stuff to the GR86 to get to go to the track. Hyundai claims that you do not need to do that with the Elantra N, and I tend to believe them.
Well, let's get this out on the track, Jack, and let's see what all of this adds up to, if anything. What do you think?
This thing hauls some serious ass. So we've driven this car on the street, we've made fun of it in the shop, we talked about N-Man and Albert Bierman and all the nonsense associated with their marketing campaign. But when you're out here, or on your favorite back road, you forget about all of that. At this price point, this has to be some of the most fun you could have.
I can't believe how good this car is, dude. I cannot believe how good this car is. I was not expecting what I just experienced in one lap of doing this. And this thing is so fast out here. This is like something I would expect out of... Dude, I don't even know what lap times this would be faster than, but it's incredible.
Yeah, I think you would worry, honestly, like an inexperienced driver in something like an E90 M3. You would give them a really hard time, or a Mustang. This thing.
This thing annihilates my S2000, like obliterates it out here. I mean, it is. It's just, let's talk through it. Steering is very interesting. It's super, super direct. It's really quick to respond. And if you make the mistake of turning in too quick and lifting throttle, this thing wants to turn its ass around. And I've noticed the ass is more planted now that there's heat in the rear. And I know Britt had talked about that before with this car. And I definitely feel like it's stabilized now more so than it was before. And I love the way the diff just pulls you through the corner. I mean, you can literally just slam on the throttle.
And it pulls you through. It reminds me of like the 2.5 way that the Integra.
Yeah, the Integra Type R that we had, the Mugen one. Yeah, agreed. The brakes are, you know, it's a pretty amazing combination of brakes, what it does in terms of like being decent on the street, and then being usable out here on the track. I mean, the pedal's a little spongy, but it never fades, at least for me so far, and I'm pretty hard on brakes.
What do you think of the drivetrain? So this motor obviously produces quite a bit of power, but how does it feel to actually use?
Well, it doesn't sound good, but I mean, what do you expect from a turbocharged four-popper, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This thing, dude, I'm stunned at how good this car is. I mean, all this joking I've been saying about this car, I never really took it seriously. This has proven me that I'm 100% wrong. This is an amazing car, and almost like you said it before, like that you would take this over a Type R in some ways.
I think the Type R may be more technically proficient than this car. It's more sophisticated front suspension, but this car's more fun.
I love the way that this car reacts. The front and the rear, the way that you can make it do things based on throttle input, braking, and weight change on the car. It feels like you're more connected in making the body work with what you want it to do versus just kind of like foot to the floor, turn in, where the Type R just kind of like it feels like it does more for you. This car feels like you can really be a good driver and still enjoy this thing. Dude, I can't even tell you how impressed I am.
So I understand we're out here on the track, but there's going to be a portion of people who are buying this car for street duty. Walk me through it. You and I both spent a decent amount of time just puttering this car through traffic. What do you think?
It's not the best street car. It's a little firm. It doesn't kill me. Even in N mode, I thought it would be really intolerable, like Focus RS bad. But I'm gonna cool this thing down. I've been driving it like a maniac. It's surprisingly decent in N mode, and when you drive it around in normal mode, if you know what you're getting into with this, I think it's okay. The suspension is just almost too stiff.
There are definitely some compromises compared to things like the GTI, Civic Si, and even the WRX, right? Like when it's wet out, this thing has crazy wheel hop in the front end, or when it's really cold.
Yeah, it does. That's street stuff, obviously.
It's a little noisier than at least the GTI, and I think compared to the Civic, the thing that you're going to notice is it is expensive-ish at $32,000 compared to something like the SI, and I think personally, now having spent a lot of time in the Veloster and dual clutch, the Kona and dual clutch, the manual gearbox doesn't live up to how good the rest of this car is.
No, that is definitely one thing. If I could say, the pedal box feel and the gearbox feel in terms of like shifter solidness and like directness are definitely not where it needs to be for a car like this. That's why I think we've argued too that the dual clutch is better.
Yeah, gun to my head, I think honestly, if it's my own money, as much as I'm Mr. Manual when it comes to cars, this is a car where you get the dual
I don't know,
clutch.
it's tough because on the street, the dual clutch would be better. Out here, I really actually enjoy driving the manual transmission. I think it's fine. You forget the linkage and all that. You get used to it.
You get to heel toe, you get to get in that dance. But out on the street, I think the dual clutch, it's like the joke we have about the Porsche stuff, right? Like, you know, in some ways the PDK makes more sense, but in some ways you also wish you had the manual.
Right, yeah.
So Mark, I think with that, it's time for us to head into the final thoughts, sir.
All right. Final thoughts on the Elantra N. So this is the first N product, even though I like the Veloster, that I would say is something that is amazing. They did a great job on this car, and you have to go back a long period of time, back to almost the 90s, to feel a front-wheel drive car with this type of refinement and thought in engineering in terms of the way that it feels to drive. And yes, we've had kind of the Focuses and the Fiestas and some of the Honda Civics, but this is just something different. and it's something different. I haven't driven something like this in the modern age of cars, and that's what I'm trying to say. So when you're driving this on track specifically, where they spend all their time, it is so engaging. The way that the car communicates, the front communicates with you, the back end moves around, and you feel like you're really part of that experience. And that's where I was taken off guard by driving this. That's on the track. On the street, different story, because all the things that make it great as a track car also make it one of the worst cars in terms of like this price point to drive every day. It's too stiff. I mean, not horribly stiff, but it grates on your nerves after long drives. The seats are very rigid. They hold you in, but again, not much breathing room in there. And then the interior, it definitely is not as good laid out as the Civic. It's definitely not as nice as the GTI in terms of ergonomics and comfort. So, you know, again, if you're buying the Elantra N because you want that hardcore car and it checks every single box, and if you're willing to make the trade-offs in comfort and losing the ability to fold down the seats and store stuff, you're gonna love this car. I promise you 100%. Assuming it's going to be somewhat reliable and your dealer experience is not going to just annoy you when you come in if you have issues. Loved driving this car, loved it overall. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next video.